Hello and welcome back to Crew Parley, the flipped version of Parley, the thing we usually do on this channel. Normally I answer and respond to your prompts as best as I can on the spot. This is my prompt and you all responded, and I'm going to respond to the responses. It's Crew Parley. Glad you'll join us. The prompt I posted was about basically game theory and outplaying people. So the prompt I wrote for you all was, in many games and other activities, mostly competitive ones, the objective boils down to anticipating your opponent and playing one step ahead of them. All sorts of games exhibit this design: chess, many trading card games, rock, paper, scissors, as well as a variety of other video games, sports, and board games. So what's the point of one over the others? Is there an instance of this type of gameplay you personally favor? Why that one? Do you hate this instead and avoid it like the plague? Why? Basically, I think a lot of these games boil down to the same thing, so I want to know how you all see them and gain some more perspectives. So I want to elaborate a little bit more about where this topic is coming from, and I'm going to do these in Crew Parley going forward. It's my prompt, and if you all could have your, voiceover incorporated into Parley easily, that would be chaotic for the workflow of Parley. But if you were here to just chat, obviously it would be nice to hear a little more clarification, right? So I will explain what I mean in a little more detail. But it was sort of interesting to hear responses where I didn't get to explain perfectly, and you do the best you can. That's sort of the whole point of Parley. But I will tell you more about where I'm coming from with this. So when I say, oh, they all basically boil down to the same thing, first of all, a lot of you might go, they do? I don't think that they do, or that's reductive and not actually a useful way to think about it. So I'm going to try to pitch you on why I think it is. And let me just say, I think this Crew Parley went really well. Like, I'm very excited about this one. So if that bothers you, I think we will unpack that successfully by the end of this Crew Parley. This one went very well from a response perspective, in my opinion. So let's take like poker and wizard poker, Magic the Gathering, classically. But, Yu-Gi-Oh! We'll talk about Yu-Gi-Oh! During this Parley. And poker. So, poker, you get basically random cards, and you can obviously know things like probability and try to choose what cards to send back and get, new cards depending on the variant of poker you're playing to play a hand that will be better. But most of the winning of poker, or like rock, paper, scissors, is bluffing. Right? Or is trying to figure out what your opponent will do or think about what you have done, and then sort of do one step ahead of them. In game theory, there's this concept that I've heard of referred to as leveling, where to win a game of chess, for example, you often need to place your piece such that it is one step ahead in the thought process of your opponent if they were thinking this. But if they were thinking this instead, you might get blown out. And interestingly, if they're thinking of something way lower on the leveling order than you were, you might also get blown out. You need to be able to detect where they're working on a mental level and then go just one step above it a lot of the time. We definitely won't get into the game theory one-upsmanship thing on that level in this Parley, but I do think it's worth gesturing at as a way to think about, when you win poker, basically you were able to present a hand such that you manipulated the betting and such to your favor in some way. And it might be to minimize losses rather than to win the hand and get the most money or whatever. And the same in Magic the Gathering. You play your aggro deck and they have their control deck, and basically, depending on when they can wipe the board and kill all your little dudes that are beating them up, and depending on how much you hold back creatures to attack them to recoup once they've wiped your board, will determine if you win. Or you're playing a combo mirror, and you have to figure out when to hold up interaction to stop your opponent's combo, versus when you can go for it, and what they have is actually just the combo, but it's your turn, so you should just go for it and kill them. And that kind of thing. Yes, obviously, playing your deck well, matters. This is just like in the poker hands, where obviously knowing the probability of replacing this card gives you a chance to get this hand makes you better at poker. But that's relatively basic on some level. You can just kind of know that, and then that's it. For poker, that's it forever. That's how it is. They could patch poker. You could make a patch. People do make a version of patch poker, but you get the point. And in Magic, you can play with decks that don't change. At some point, you are more or less piloting your deck or whatever the game's, mechanism is. And winning the game comes down to outplaying your opponent in that way. And so that's what I mean by this parlay. That it comes down to that thinking in both cases. But that's not all there is to the game. Obviously, the main difference is that in Magic the Gathering, you can modify and rebuild the thing you are piloting to do that outplaying. For example, it is absolutely possible, and people do in Magic the Gathering, play decks that are designed to not play that outplaying game, to not win that way, to win deterministically instead. Which, you know, when people are trying to win by outplaying you, it obviously can be an uphill battle, but it's still interesting that people do that. And so that's what we'll be delving into here. Obviously, we're not discussing the idea that none of these games are different from one another, so why do people play them? We're just discussing the reasons why people play different variants of this type of game. And I thought you all did a very good job. So let's launch into it a little more. I have more to say, but it will come up through context through the responses. Just Rusty, let's start. You said, I think playing fighting games, yep, of course we're going to get to that topic, right, has given me a really good insight into ways to make rock, paper, scissors more interesting. So, and think for yourself, if you're listening to this parlay, what would make rock, paper, scissors more interesting, potentially? I, of course, saw this coming. I'm really happy that you started with this point because it's a very key thing for this discussion. Having characters be varying degrees of good at throwing rock, paper, or scissors is more interesting than a perfectly balanced game because it provides potential information to work off of for you and your opponent. Imagine if we played rock, paper, scissors, and you know, I just love rocks, or like I injured my finger, and so I don't want to make the scissors symbol or like hold my hand out for paper. It hurts a little bit, so subconsciously at least, I would like to make a fist a little bit more. Okay, so now you'll win, right? Because you can just throw paper. But if I know that you have paid attention to my hand wound, and therefore you think that I'm going to throw rock, then I'm going to win, because you'll throw paper and then I'll throw scissors, and then I win. But if you know that I know that you know that, etc., and then there's the levels again, right? Exactly. So I wish I could claim that I'd scripted this myself. That is literally just the first response. I usually just do these in order, and it works out that well. Perfect. Just Rusty says, if you mainly play a character who's great at throwing rock, their moves of that type are just like really strong. They do a lot of damage, or they come out fast, whatever. Above average at throwing paper, and then terrible at throwing scissors. Your opponent is going to want to mainly throw paper, and paper-based characters are probably going to be a tough matchup. It makes it interesting. How often do you want to use your weak scissors knowing they're probably going to use paper, but you just don't get that much if you win those bouts? You don't do that much damage, or it's not that much of a combo starter. Different genre entirely, but me and my housemates have been having a good time with Age of Empires, where different civilizations are good to varying degrees at throwing rock, paper, or scissors. Here it's good old horses, spears, and archers, although that's an oversimplification. There'll be a lot of oversimplifications in this parlay. The mind games of trying to figure out what your opponent is going to do, like what army composition they'll have in real time, combined with the fact that you know their civilization's strengths and can also spend resources on scouting them out and knowing what you suspect their scouts have seen of your economy, all make for really interesting mind games. There's also the fact that if you have a good enough economy, 17 rocks still beats 4 papers. At the level we play at, it's sometimes better to just ignore the mind games entirely and focus on good production and fundamentals. What an incredible start to the parlay. In fact, in a way we could end it here. I think you basically hit all of the big points for this subject, though we will go into a lot of detail about them. Rock, paper, scissors, in many ways, is a pretty good way to reduce the wizard pokering. Not necessarily because it's usually 3 options vying versus like 2 different plays necessarily, but because rock, paper, scissors very elegantly demonstrates that leveling thing that I tried badly to explain before. Hopefully that makes more sense now. You think they're going to do this, so you do that, but if they think you think that they're going to think that you'll do that, etc., and you have to pick the right one, or you may not lose, but you'll be making a decision largely randomly instead. And a lot of the time, rock, paper, scissors illustrates that if you pick the wrong level to work on, you will directly lose instead because you'll counter yourself. So yeah, that's very useful. And then you made another good point that actually nobody else brought up, but I was quite excited to see. I think it is important that these games not be all about this. that there is a baseline, like a palette or a sort of blank slate upon which normal gameplay takes place, and there are frequent but not constant interjections of trying to outplay your opponent. That is, sometimes you do the normal gameplay, and that is coherent and clear, and people know you're doing that. You can't do things that are too fancy and have that be rewarded, because then it means that being mired in illusions of countering your opponent is better than just like doing the objective of the game. There needs to be a sort of pressure to just basically win normally, where if the opponent's, deck in Magic the Gathering is just bad, but you're too worried about what they might play to kill you, then the game is just sort of weird. Like, it would be better if you just won, if you're really that much more powerful. These are competitions. And a thing that's going to come up later is that you do need to be at a relatively similar skill level with another player to have this experience. You could preempt that eventually we're going to get to this idea that a game which is designed in such a way as to make it likely that you play someone of a similar skill level obviously would be a thing that would make this kind of thing better, right? That good matchmaking, but you can do more than just that. But at the same time, I also think it's good to keep in mind that you're probably going to play lots of matches of this experience, right? It's a competitive experience. And so making it be that you can just win normally is still sort of a useful thing in some ways, in my opinion. There's a very popular StarCraft, I think is where it's from, meme if they're doing something weird, it's probably not that good, just go kill them. And I think that's a really important takeaway from this part. How good it is to just go kill them instead of responding to what they're doing matters a lot for these games. I think the just go kill them thing it's too good. In StarCraft, I don't play StarCraft. I've played StarCraft, but I don't play StarCraft. My understanding is that it is too good to just go kill them, basically. That is, you have to be using a very competitive and powerful strategy calculated out mathematically, probably by somebody else, not a creative decision-making point, or it's way too punishing and you'll just be killed. Again, this doesn't mean that StarCraft is just bad or something, but I am proposing that it is not an ideal ingredient for this type of encounter. You want to balance fundamentals and counterplay to some extent, and I think that in most games the balance is not such that it is ripe for this type of gameplay. In a lot of games, a lot of competitive activities, the fundamentals are too good, I would say, is the main takeaway. If you're just really good at the mechanics of a fighting game where execution is difficult, that is, you do like a very specific movement on your controller or gamepad, and this allows you to do a better attack or a harder to block combo, but some players will simply be unable to execute those combos. I'm not trying to decry that as an experience in general, but for our purposes in this discussion, I think it's fair to say that is bad for creating these moments, because it means that there will be some times where if you're just really good at the game and don't pay any attention to your opponent, to some extent you do just kind of win, or like you get tools that they cannot have. I think that's important. Sometimes this can be interesting because it can be used to bluff. For example, I'm aware that a lot of people in the fighting game community like that because they feel it leads to interesting counterplay and outplaying, because they see it as like you don't know if they will go for the risky implementation of that attack. But personally, I feel like it's already enough of an abstract concept when you're assuming what somebody else is going to do. This may just be my preference, but I question whether it is good for it to be unknown whether they will be able to execute this move, like regardless of whether they would tactically choose to do so. I just sort of feel like that's a different activity. It's going to be hype if you're in a tournament hall and somebody does it, but I'm not sure that matters at all for this discussion of game theory. I feel like that, sure, I understand why people would like it, but is that actually a good way to reliably create this experience? I'm not entirely sure. I think no, is what I'm saying. I think in most competitive activities, the fundamentals are too strong to optimize for creating these counterplay moments. That is, tactics and, well, another thing that we're going to get back to later, need to be relatively buffed compared to like physical skill or fundamentals in the game. this could be done a lot of ways. For another example, reducing the amount of knowledge check in the game is going to come up a lot in this parlay. If you have to learn too much raw data, some people just won't be able to hold on to all that information while like doing an active activity, and therefore you've kind of done a mental version of like, are you mechanically good enough to do the combo? I think that is also, again, not an inherently evil thing to have in society, but it doesn't promote getting these counterplay experiences more. It would be better if we could take those things mostly as a given, and how much we take them as a given is the thing that is in question here. So, interesting. I do also want to preface before we go on that obviously most people are going to like the competitive activity they like because it is the one that they have been able to jive with, and not at all for any logical reason that we would explain here. If you asked most of humanity, which competitive activity do you enjoy for outplaying people, they will say whichever one they enjoy and then just make up reasons they don't, well, at least didn't believe until you just asked them just now. They will just make up reasons on the spot to justify it. This is fine. This is a thing that humans normally do, but it's worth taking a moment to discard that and say that's not really useful. I destroyed my entire recording setup for the T-streams, and instead we're looking to discuss what mechanics would lead to people in theory liking these activities. It doesn't really matter what any of us actually like, though some of you have done a very good job leveraging that experience to make interesting conclusions. I'm just saying, I think it's worth noting, especially for this topic, that humans would normally fail to do that. Like, we can only do this here because we have a stream and a Discord community and 3 YouTube channels that are dedicated to nothing but trying to cut through that. And normally people would fail to do this. So I guess thank you for being able, doing your best to do that. I really appreciate it. I think people did a very good job, genuinely. And so as we keep going. So takeaways from this part, very good start. Just Rusty, in my opinion, basically the perfect way to start these parlay, is that there's a balance between fundamentals and counterplay. There's this idea that making things a bit, you basically do rock, paper, scissors, but then make something specialize a little bit, gives the opponent known information that you can then counterplay off of. It gives them assumptions, reasonable assumptions, but they know that you could play counter to those assumptions, and then they have to decide how to anticipate that. And I'm sure we've all had the experience where someone chokes when they're at very low health in a fighting game because they become predictable, or their opponent becomes predictable, and suddenly the game changes a bit, because there's a sort of perspective, but then there's circumstances that modify it, and creating that kind of thing is good. We could even go further and say a very basic thing that benefits counterplay would be having a score of some form, and the score needs to matter in some way. So in a fighting game, like your health bar, right? A lot of fighting games, even if you block, you still take some damage, or you take damage of some kind. And so if you're at low health, you simply do behave in a different way. You kind of have to, but then you also kind of want to. Magic the Gathering, you have a life total, and while any intermediate Magic player knows that using your life as a resource is good, one of the things I like about Magic compared to similar games is that it is very often correct to take a modest amount of damage to the face as a way to gain like tempo or some time over your opponent. Whereas in other similar games, one of which we will talk about in this parlay, that is almost always a terrible choice, and you'll instantly lose if you do that. The main benefit, I think, of the life total thing is that you play differently when you're at low life. If they have a 5/5 on board and you have 5 life, yeah, if you don't block it, you die. You have to defend yourself against it or you lose, sure. If you do not use the spell to kill it, then they can assume you don't have the spell because you die if you don't use the spell. But if you're at like 7 life, I mean, you could let it hit you, but if they have basically anything else, then you die. And so are you going to let that happen? You know, you want to play differently. And so it doesn't have to be that the score resource is extremely important. You know, in Magic, it is often correct to just take some damage. People aren't that precious with their life total if they're any good at Magic. But it's important enough to create these moments of context, I think. And fighting game health bars are a classic example, though you could argue they are slightly more important in some ways. And so, yeah, that. Cool. Let's move on to iPatch Notes. You said in my neck of the woods, Pokemon Showdown, singles mostly, strikes the fairest balance between information asymmetry and total possibility space. Glorious. Okay, so some unknown stuff, hidden information, and then like what is the total breadth of the things they could do. Breaking that down by opposite example, take basically any other fighting game. Smash, say, or Soul Calibur, or Skullgirls, or other S-shaped fighting games could have the combatants move in any direction or initiate any of their programmed moves. Pokemon, being turn-based, has the much more constrained 4 moves and the active switching Pokemon. Your one action in D&D or whatever is only ever going to be one of the 5 things in Pokemon. Both players know this, and taking a non-switching action illuminates the possibility space by 1 move, like you know that their Pokemon has that ability. A long enough match might showcase all 4 of a particular Mon's moves, and what the Mon is capable of is now known, or is it? You're not sure for sure. Right, so this is a really interesting direction to take the conversation. One way that you can make these competitive activities sort of different or appealing in different ways from each other is by changing the type of known information, or making it so some information initially starts unknown. Your Pokemon could have moves that you choose. So even a player who's memorized every move a Pikachu could have doesn't know which 4 moves your Pikachu has, for example. Yet, but then they do gain that information as you play. This isn't the same as in a fighting game where most of the time, well, we'll get to a counterexample later, but most of the time, you, in theory, could know every single move the opponent has, and they can't not be able to do those moves. Again, this is sort of why I think that the execution of a move being difficult is sort of bad for this activity, because it creates a situation where we were in a superposition of you could know all the moves that they could do and you couldn't know all the moves that they could do. I feel like it's better to just be able to pick an activity where you do or do not know those moves, rather than making the game design somewhat random depending on who you're playing against. That doesn't seem good to me, but there are some advantages I talked about before. So yeah, this is an interesting way to think about the subject. In D&D, you know the constraints that they built their constrained set of actions in, like what classes and stuff they could take, but not which actions they have chosen to take. Well, I mean, it depends what kind of game master you are, but you're playing, I don't know, like PvP in D&D. I don't know. The Pokemon example is better. I do want to point out that I think that the like Smash, Soul Calibur, Skullgirls fighting games being different than Pokemon in this way is pretty subjective. A lot of people who like those fighting games and enjoy the counterplay in them think of it as the same thing, basically. They don't not know what moves their opponent's Pokemon have, and then they learn them over the course of the fight. That's true, but they can't actually move in any direction or initiate any of their programmed moves. People who are way into fighting games generally see it as, oh no, they're only going to do one of these 3 things. How that character doesn't even have moves that hit at this range except for these. And you often hear people describe visualizing like the hitboxes of all the moves the opponent has as a sort of giant spread of red telegraphs on the screen that you're imagining, which show you, the player, where your opponent could hit you. But if they commit to this hurt box, then you know that they can't do this one, and so maybe you could go in low or something like that. I think a lot of people who play fighting games do not see it as like they could initiate any of those moves. But I take your broader point. Even if you do or don't see it that way, in Pokemon, you literally can't do more than a few different things, right? You just can't. It's not a matter of whether you know that they're thinking about that or not. And you could argue that this is potentially beneficial to this type of counterplay. You don't need to learn which abilities they will realistically use. That element is sort of hand-waved, and they can only use these 4 moves. If you're trying to beeline this counterplay experience, that seems good, because you're jumping directly to that part, right? You don't need to learn that it's not really true that they would want to use all these different moves. They would really mostly be thinking about just these 3. Though you can imagine some theoretical fighting game where the enemy character has a thought bubble above their head that shows you inside of it the list of moves that will currently be able to hit or like have good frame data or be commonly used. Yu-Gi-Oh!, which will come up a lot more later, don't worry, actually has this mechanic on the Master Duel client where when you play a card, especially in response to an opponent's card, the game tells tells you a percentage, which is how often when a player owns that card and has it available, do they play it in response to the thing that you just played it in response to. I don't think that's actually that useful in Master Duel alone, but that's interesting, isn't it? The game kind of tells you how likely it is that this thing would happen, attempting to give you meta knowledge in an artificial way, I guess. I think that's an interesting idea. The point is that Pokemon is kind of sidestepping that whole discussion, and you could argue that that is good if these games are trying to remove the need to learn that so that you can enjoy the counterplay. That's good. Again, you'll find that many players will say that's bad, and they'll say that it's bad partly because they enjoy needing to learn which moves the opponent is able to hit you with. And I'm not passing judgment on that for the purposes of this parlay. I'm just saying if you strictly want counterplay to be the experience a lot of players of your game have, that seems net bad to me. It seems like a thing you could enjoy if you want skill mastery of the game, but this isn't a parlay about that. So not to say it's evil or bad if you enjoy that, but I don't see it as being productive for creating this feeling. Pokemon, good example. While the functional output of each Pokemon, Apechunuts continues, is predictable, there are several paradigm-shifting held items. Leftovers is probably the most obvious, tiny bits of chip healing through the course of a battle. There are more quiet or more dangerously less obvious held items, like the Choice series. The Choice items. A Pokemon holding the Choice Scarf is 50% faster than a specimen of the exact same stats, but a different held item. Unlike leftovers or other items, though, there's no proof positive UI element that a Choice Scarf was used. Like with leftovers, you'll see their health regenerate at the end of the turn. Or the game gives you a message, right? Anyway, the players can infer what might have happened after the fact, which delves further into bluffing. The choice items famously lock the user into continuously using the first move they select. Yes, by having the Choice Scarf on your Pokemon, my memory anyway is that the Pokemon then gets 50% speed, but the first move they choose, they have to spam, except you are allowed to switch them out. So they can't change what move they're using. But again, as iPatchNotes points out, the game doesn't tell you that that is because of the Choice Scarf. You just might notice that the Pokemon attacks faster than you would expect, and they are spamming this one move over and over again, but is that because of the Choice Scarf, or could it be that they change their speed EVs such as would achieve that speed, and then they're just bluffing that they have a Choice Scarf? You do something that tries to play around the move they're spamming, but then they knew you were going to do that, and they use something else because they do not have a Choice Scarf equipped. This could happen, right? I bet that is sort of common. A Choice Scarf can be inferred if a slower Mediumon defies its speed tier, but a Choice Band or Choice Specs is just more damage. There are other choice items that give you a big boost to a stat that isn't speed and lock you into spamming the same move over and over again, right? If the suspected choice user would have fainted its target anyway, its actual held item has not been confirmed. Oh, interesting. Right, so if they just add damage and you use a move that would kill the target anyway, then the opponent has not learned whether you are using one of those items. How many times does the suspected choice user have to act to know that it is actually locked into a move? Right. What if the trainer swaps it out before it ever acts a second time? Echo this to any number of other silent items waiting for an explicit action, like knockoff, target loses their item, or a condition is met, like reducing a super effective hit once. There's an item that does that to confirm what item is actually held. Yeah, really cool. And so you can see some other examples of the player knows that these items exist, but they don't know for sure that the opponent has them. We're now getting into this element where what do we consider to be the value of letting the player modify the options available to them, as long as they can't invent entirely new options that the opponent can't understand. This allows the player to basically modify their fighting game character's roster. They can do moves that are like modified versions of rock, paper, and scissors, but not modified to literally anything. There's still a limited possibility space. Such counterplay is available. Cool. Yep. When it comes to esports or team-based hero shooters, that iPatchNotes, not me, the action is chaotic enough from the spectator's perspective when, yeah, there are technically 8 or 10 different stories being told at the same time. Some games might allow the viewer to hop between player to player to see the world as they do, and that type of PvP is not enjoyable to me. Right. So this is an interesting topic I didn't think would come up about spectating. When you spectate a lot of esports, the spectating and the commentating is not about this subject at all, even if the game is significantly about this subject, which is one of the things that I'm most disinterested in about watching sports, but also esports, though it can be more interesting when it is more of a one-on-one, like spectating Smash, for example, or some fighting games, or something like maybe tennis. I don't know, I don't watch tennis, but singles tennis, something like that. I could see maybe being like this. Now, of course, most people don't watch sports to think about the sport in the first place. They're mostly there to be sort of part of the team or community. And again, topic for a different parlay. But just to say, I think this is a good point. Not only that how you can spectate the activity kind of matters, because that's a really good way to learn this subject, and it can be very fun to spectate a match where the two players are trying to outplay each other, and that's visible in some way. That is, however, very uncommon in my experience and quite difficult to generate. Like, if it's more than 1v1, pretty much forget it right there in most cases. That's not 100% true. I just think it's interesting to point out the divide that, like, I've watched competitive PUBG before, and the individual players are trying to outplay each other, but you won't get that from spectating the game. You know what I mean? That isn't a thing that the game is really built around you being able to enjoy, even though it is happening, and the players playing are probably, to an extent, getting to enjoy that. So that is interesting to consider. But I would say not a death sentence. It is good to be able to see this from afar in a game. And we'll probably get into this more later, because you need to be able to detect games that have this depth to them. And one way to do that would be by seeing it, which you can't in many cases. It's also worth considering how spectating it reveals how janky it will be. And in this case, that's not necessarily true, right? Like, the actual counterplay available in, I don't know, I used PUBG as an example, is pretty different from the amount you would see if you spectated it. There's a counterexample here. Even Yu-Gi-Oh!, the PvP game I Patch Notes, have the most spectator stake in, next to Pokemon, is actually not something I enjoy watching, since the burden of knowledge is that high. In Pokemon Showdown, I have a fairly good memory for this sprite of Pokemon equals this role. And Ogerpon Wellspring, what the hell is that, is basically only ever going to be a physical attacker, maybe some utility. But Yu-Gi-Oh!, learn the entire game right now or watch a single match multiple times. That could be as much me being able to retain Pokemon moves and species more than Yu-Gi-Oh! Archetypes and staples, though. Yeah, no, I don't think it is. Yu-Gi-Oh! Is definitely going to be a hot button example in this discussion. I will get back to it much more in a minute, but I think that it's a good point here, right? Like, because Pokemon is narrowing the possibility space, we're now in a situation where we get to talk about, you want to create counterplay, how much modifying the abilities available to the player is good for creating counterplay. And we might say, well, Pokemon is rather little, but still some option to wiggle around what options each Pokemon has. Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a lot, but also the amount of knowledge you need, like the amount you need to read cards to understand a wild Yu-Gi-Oh! Archetype, is absolutely ridiculous. Like, having played a ton of Yu-Gi-Oh! Now, actually, to experience this for myself, I'm maybe about 100 hours into Master Duel, give or take, though a good amount of that was, well, when I say AFK, it was reading the damn cards, so I'm not sure that really counts as time I wasn't playing. Right, a lot of the time in Yu-Gi-Oh!, if you don't know every single card's full text offhand, which basically nobody does, when you play a match of ranked in Yu-Gi-Oh!, the timer is not a limit on how much time you have to do your actions most of the time. It's a limit on how quickly you need to read your opponent's cards to know what the insane archetype that nobody has ever seen before does. And in a competitive game, yeah, they kind of just assume you have all that knowledge if you're spectating, a Yu-Gi-Oh! Match, which you don't. Like, that doesn't work. That just doesn't work. And so we will come back to this later, but I think it's a really important concept, this knowledge check subject. It's very similar to the point earlier about how it might be good to have it be that the opponent would need to know where your hurt boxes are from your fighting character. they need to learn what attacks that character has that can hit them, or they get punished. Sure, that could be enjoyable to people in some way, but is it a good way to generate reliable counterplay experiences specifically? Not an overall good competition, but specifically reliable counterplay. I would say it's not terrible, but no, it's not a good way to do that. You are putting one more barrier, a barrier of some knowledge, in the way of the player being able to appreciate that. Yu-Gi-Oh, in my opinion, puts a pretty gigantic barrier in the way of that. Pokemon does something to rein this in. There are a lot of different moves and Pokemon and abilities and items that you would need to learn, and even things like the EV thresholds that a given Pokemon can hit, having dipped my toes into this a little bit myself. But they can only have a few at a time, right? When you play against someone's Yu-Gi-Oh deck, in Master Duel, for example, their deck is 40 cards and a 15-card extra deck. And a lot of things about the design of Yu-Gi-Oh mean that many decks want to have mostly one-ofs of cards, with only a few three-ofs. And those probably will be cards, your Ash Blossom and Crimson Spring, if you play Yu-Gi-Oh! If we're being real, that's what we're talking about here. But a lot of the rest will be one-offs. Now, a lot of them are often going to be one-offs from the archetype that they're clearly playing. If I'm playing Sky Striker, which is what I am playing, by the way, if you play Yu-Gi-Oh, if I play Sky Striker Engage, which is their tutor effect, it's not rocket science that I now also have Afterburners, Widow Anchor, Jamming Signal, or whatever that card's called, and then that my extra deck contains at least one Kagari, Shizuku, Hayate, hopefully Ace Zero, and then like probably multiples of some of those, so there might not be too much stuff in there. It's really common to play Typhon, the XYZ Superstar Slayer Typhon. And so, like, I'm not trying to act like it's a complete mystery, every single card that comes up, and a lot of them will be staples. However, the thing that I just rattled off is still maybe a third of my deck, and so what is the rest of the stuff? Has the player learned this strategy already? If not, to play the game at all, they need to read all of those cards, because none of them do much on their own either. You have to now know, if the point of this card is to fetch a Sky Striker card, okay, what on earth could they be fetching? Like, what are all of the Sky Striker cards, basically? And that the amount of knowledge you need at any given time to play is much higher. I think that matters a lot as well. Let's take a fighting game as another example. And so you're playing against this character. You may have learned that character. And so now, because the characters are defined, the player can't change the characters. These are the abilities that Baiken has. She's this one archetype of character, and I know her abilities. And you play against Soul Bad Guy, and you know that you don't know their abilities. Okay, but you do or you don't. You can just know them all. Whereas if you play Yu-Gi-Oh, if I just put a weird card in my deck, you know most of my archetype, but not this one card that I'm allowed to granularly change out. Again, Pokemon does have this problem the same way to an extent, but the space is more limited. The number of slots you can change, the number of slots in the build system is more limited, and thus that's reined in to an extent. The Yu-Gi-Oh has a nuclear level of this problem, in my humble opinion. We will be talking about that more. Because I think it's a really interesting point for this subject. It kind of seems like it could be beneficial to let the player sort of fiddle a little more with the options they have. It does provide options for assuming counterplay, and we can rein it in by giving the player not too many options to fiddle with. But it can get out of hand if the options are too interconnected. Again, in Yu-Gi-Oh, you could say a lot of the problem here is actually the archetypes. It's not so much that there are 40 cards in their main deck and 15 cards in their extra deck, but that a lot of those cards don't actually do anything of significance without you knowing what 15 other cards do. And so it's actually okay if the cards are unknown. It's just not okay if you have to know all of them to make the information usable at all, but they can granularly change them out. In Pokemon, you can know individual moves, and your opponent has the ability to change those individual moves, but not very many. So you might not know exactly what they have, but they can only have so many things. And in a fighting game, you do need to know everything that the opponent's character has, for the most part, but they can't change what those things are. Yu-Gi-Oh then has the worst of both worlds for this part of the discussion, where you do need to know everything they have to play meaningfully against a lot of their cards, but they can granularly change those things. Sort of the tough part about Pokemon and the tough part about the fighting game combined, which is not good for this type of counterplay, in my opinion. It takes a frankly unbelievable level of meta knowledge to be able to correctly outplay most decks in Yu-Gi-Oh! Except for one key strength that Yu-Gi-Oh's design has, which we're going to get to in a minute. Bionic Me says, to me, the distinction mainly seems to come in two parts, accessibility and aesthetics. Accessibility meaning just what functions best for you, or what you're otherwise simply most comfortable with. For me, this primarily means relatively slow-paced action with a lower focus on manual dexterity. Real-time strategy games and classical fighting games just don't seem to handle well for me on a functional level, while card games, and as far as action games go, specifically Battlerite and Dark Souls, have simply worked better in my hands. The games that probably function the worst for me are first-person shooters. Hunt Showdown has been a tenuous middle ground for me and my friends, compromising the high-level dexterity gameplay that they like with the slower, more strategically rewarding pace which fits me better. In the end, though, it's still been a bit too much of the former aspect. But this is an important point broadly. Right, I think it's fair to say that in general, if the game is slower paced, it is better for these counterplay moments because you have time to think about them to an extent. Having it be that there is some time pressure to do your counterplay is a form of fun that we could explore. I think Hunt Showdown is a great example where the matches are long enough that you have time to think about your tactics on the whole, but also there is some time pressure at all times as well. Like you want to do things fast in Hunt Showdown, but you want to do them quietly, and those things are at odds. And so the game provides a good balance of both. Now, I think I take your point as someone who played a lot of Hunt Showdown myself and liked it for exactly that reason. The problem is that you still ultimately need to be good at a first-person shooter more than other people to do anything at all, and I'm not. And you get very little practice because you often have to do a whole match and you'll barely shoot at all. I liked when they added a game mode where it's more like big team battle and you just kill everybody, simply because it lets you learn the shooting mechanics so that when you do this long match, you're actually prepared. I would say then we have a flaw with that strategy where, yes, it's cool to get the player time to think about the counterplay, but also there's some time pressure applied. It's a live action game, but you have time to think about counterplay. But a big flaw is the ability to actually learn all of that. That basically has to be accomplished by making the matches long. And then also there's like not that much shooting in a normal match of Hunt Showdown. And this makes the game time consuming to learn, kind of a different type of knowledge barrier. Giving the game a different game mode that helps you learn that faster would be good in theory. I wonder how Hunt Showdown is doing. Anyway, great start. And I think accessibility is an interesting way to word this one, right? The amount of time pressure and like action pressure while thinking about counterplay will vary from person to person. I'm sure some people right now are thinking, oh, but it's so thrilling to think about that while thinking on your feet and fighting against an opponent for your life. That can make the experience more exciting. Two things. Right, I mean, to an extent, it's just flow. Are you having enough stimulation that your brain is in that spot where everything is churning in a healthy way? But that would just be a matter of adjusting it to your taste. Right away, we can say, what is a good form of this wizard poker thing that I'm asking about for the entire topic of this parlay? Well, we want a range of them because you're going to want to adjust it to where you hit a good flow state for the amount of that pressure that feels like pressure to you because our brains don't work in the same way at the same speed. On the other hand, I do also want to say that I'm a little bit skeptical that time pressure is as good of a thing as it is for this subject. I kind of feel like in fighting games, for an example, this is a subject that community is very aware of, but could it possibly be that they're more interested in the skill expression aspect of the game, and having the time pressure means it's not reasonable to think about the outplaying leveling aspect too much, which is what those people prefer? And that's perfectly fine, but I'm not sure that I agree that it actually is good for the outplaying to have there be that much time pressure. Basically, I'm saying I would argue maybe there's a maximum on how much time pressure is actually good for pursuing outplaying your opponent specifically. You could have it splash in a game and be in a very healthy, fun place for people in a game that wasn't focused on that with tons of time pressure. But I'm not sure I agree that much pressure on thinking on your feet is actually good for the outplaying part, if that makes sense. I can just see why people might enjoy that anyway. It's kind of fun to have very limited resources and be given 10 seconds to figure out what the best thing you can calculate in that limited, inadequate amount of time is, and then you do your best. Like, that's cool. I do feel like that's something slightly different. That's more like improvising, which I also really enjoy. So I have thought about a lot myself too, but I don't think is the exact same thing, is meaningfully different. And then aesthetics is simply something you vibe with, or perhaps even something you can make part of your identity. For as much as I enjoy the general vibes of Golgari Magic the Gathering, I, Zandy, do like that as well, but remember, this is Bionic Me. Yu-Gi-Oh! Just has so much more going on as a whole package, as well as a broader variety of aesthetics to align yourself with. Absolver is another, most unfortunate example, where I love the aesthetics and the ability to even customize the general vibe of your personal fighting style, but where the game's baseline controls are just really badly fit for the keyboard and mouse input that I strongly prefer over the presumed controller, as well as the general pace of it just being a tad too high for my liking. Right, so Absolver, we will talk about more, and a very key example here, but you can see the thing, like, you're not even really rejecting any of the things about the game itself necessarily. We just understand at this point in the discussion that players will need to adjust how live action or time pressure the game is to their tastes. And so it's good that there's lots of different competitions, even if they boil down to a relatively similar thing, because you're going to need to adjust exactly which one you play for. Yeah, that makes total sense. Now, the Magic and Yu-Gi-Oh thing, this is a place where yeah, it's really interesting to unpack a little bit. When you say just has so much more going on, I'm gonna have to put some words in your mouth, so forgive me. Yeah, could mean a lot of things, and I think that is pretty reductive as well. Mechanically, I don't think that's true. Yu-Gi-Oh has more text, and I don't necessarily think that that means there's more complexity or like counterplay or interesting meta decisions to be had, depending on the level of play we're talking about. But there are some very key differences between the games. And I would say what's true is that Yu-Gi-Oh has a very, very large variety of disparate strategies. But that is maybe not good for this subject, is what I'm going to suggest. Let's go back to the criteria from before. Yu-Gi-Oh is doing a sort of worst of both worlds thing over here, where you have to know a lot of an archetype to effectively play against it. For example, if an opponent is playing, you know, off the top of my head, I don't really know. Okay, but like Malice, basically. You know, they're playing some popular deck. You do need to know pretty much all the cards in the deck offhand and where to stop them as they're comboing off specifically, and then what they might have in their hand that can extend their combo, or you cannot meaningfully play against the deck. You cannot just read the card that they played and then play meaningfully against the deck. You need to pretty much offhand know essentially every card in that archetype. You never need to do this in Magic the Gathering. It is still relevant what meta stuff they would have, but there are still a much more limited space of possibilities where they're chaining cards into other cards. And so Magic has this thing where you usually can just know the card they just played. You don't really need to know the other cards that could exist to play against that card. It's not irrelevant what the other cards are, sure, but you're usually surprisingly fine without knowing that stuff. And that's for a key reason we'll get to in a minute. While Yu-Gi-Oh also allows you to granularly change little things about a strategy, how many of that staple in Malice are you playing, for example? And players disagree about this to an extent, which can be interesting. You can get interestingly blown out by a player who you think only has one copy of a card, but they are doing something a bit weird and playing two, and that could be good for some specific reason. But and that's not necessarily bad, but for outplaying them, you could argue this is definitely a larger barrier to entry. However, a really big thing Yu-Gi-Oh does that makes it, to be blunt, I think, possible to play at all, is that decks have similar outputs. This is a really key thing for us figuring out how to make a system where the player can adapt to what they enjoy, but the opponent can still actually respond. I've played some ranked in Master Duel with all of these strategies that I just said were the worst of both worlds for knowledge checks. Did I just magically internalize all that information? No. I don't know what the opponent is doing most of the time. It's not even possible to know what the opponent is doing most of the time. But interestingly, you can still play to an extent. And the reason is that the decks have similar comparable outputs. How many negates, how many things that basically counterspell your opponent's cards are they able to end on? And how many can you guess they might have in their hand? How many hand traps do they have left? How many cards in hand at all? that could be hand traps do they have left at the end of their combo or board? How much damage does their common end board do? How defensive is it? How much do they play board breakers that let them kind of explode through whatever bullshit you threw onto the board on your turn? And these are things that can be interpreted across archetypes. Yu-Gi-Oh! Has hundreds of disparate archetypes, where to interrupt their game plan in an effective way, you do need to know a ridiculous amount of knowledge about that one specific archetype. And that could be seen as a very big barrier to counterplay. But it has this other key quality that helps rein that in a lot, which is that a lot of the decks are ultimately producing a comparable resource, like amount of attack on the board to kill your opponent, amount of negates of the opponent's actions, like stuff like that. And this means you can kind of interfere with your opponent in some way. You can know that you will likely need, X, Y, and Z effects. And that wasn't intended to be a joke about XYZ monsters in Yu-Gi-Oh! But there you go. Now Magic has the same thing. You often your board or your commander or whatever it is basically outputs like card advantage or tokens or tempo in some way, like it slows people down to an extent. And because the cards don't kind of directly combo with other specific cards, you can kind of know in general more of what your opponent's going to get without needing to know every single card or every card in their archetype, which sort of doesn't exist anyway, offhand. Now, there's a trade-off, of course. Right. The number of aesthetics available in Magic is dramatically lower. I think you hit the nail on the head about that. And so the player's ability to adjust to something they will prefer is lower. Now, I think the gripe I have with this point is that both games are utterly massive. I would argue that if Yu-Gi-Oh! Wants to have enough aesthetics that the player can pick a specific one they want, there are so many the player won't even find the one they would enjoy the most. There probably will be something for everyone, but I'm not sure that it needs to be that large. Magic has a way more limited space of like the type of deck you can play, but just way more relatively limited. It's still huge. Like there's still a ridiculously large variety of things you can do. And I would say, I think it's fair to feel that way. If I can assume that you haven't played a ton of Magic the Gathering, I feel like it's like the thing in Yu-Gi-Oh! You might need to push quite far into the game for that to be appreciable. And certainly, like I was just criticizing, in Yu-Gi-Oh! There probably will be something specifically for you, but it's going to take a lot of doing to find it a lot of the time. And I think that's somewhat true in Magic as well, maybe more in that you kind of have to invent those archetypes. We have kind of, but we could more dig into my pot of commander decks that I manage with my group of friends. I'm the primary person managing the decks, but we all share them, and they often input like, I want a strategy like this, or this deck is too good at that. And I'm the one primarily fiddling with them, but they often do too. And we've pushed the decks to be very extreme and weird, but relatively low power. And so a lot of really interesting strategies bubble up from that process, and basically fit with something like bracket 3 or 4 commander, I would say, if you play like general commander. It's not exactly the same, and we do use a slightly different set of rules, but that's a thing that you do in Magic. That's another thing, is Yu-Gi-Oh! Kind of has a default format, whereas Magic doesn't really. Like, you kind of do need to pick a format. Nobody ever doesn't pick a format when they play, really, kitchen table Magic aside. Whereas in Yu-Gi-Oh! I think it's fair to assume people are playing like the one big format with a lot of stuff in it, unless they are going out of their way to play a very niche side format. That might be not true. I'm just saying that's been my experience. I don't want to get into this comparison too much, but it's interesting because there's not a huge amount of difference between these two games in this discussion as a whole, right? They're both basically trading card games where you have the customizing your thing, so they kind of have to know what you're doing as a whole, but you can also make granular changes to it. But then they have the key difference that most cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! Directly chain into other specific cards that you would need to know what they did, or the card they just played isn't significant. Whereas in Magic, that doesn't happen very often. They generally get a broad card, a widely applicable card. Archetypes, such as they are much less connected, to the point of almost not even existing in the first place. And yes, people say in Magic, oh, you're playing the vampires deck. What does vampires play nowadays? As if there is one strategy we all agree on, but they're just wrong and there isn't. Whereas in Yu-Gi-Oh, that's much more true. you're playing Tearlaments. Okay, you're mostly playing those cards. You might change the amount of them you're playing or cut a specific card, but you can assume much more about what the person is playing than you can in Magic. I'll just note that people do still refer to it in Magic as if you can know that there is that one correct way to play that strategy. That's just much less true than it is in Yu-Gi-Oh! In my experience. You could argue this both ways, right? In Yu-Gi-Oh! You need to know more cards that are interconnected to have the experience of being able to counterplay them, but the cards are more often interconnected, or like more often played together, you could say. In Magic, you don't need to know, but also the variety of what they could have is way larger. Now, I think Magic comes out ahead in that equation for counterplay because the end products and what your opponent is doing are much more open-ended. You can't know as much what your opponent has specifically, but you just don't really need to know that. Whereas in Yu-Gi-Oh, you do need to know that, but you can also know it significantly more. If you couldn't, the game would arguably just be impossible to play coherently. If cards were as interlocked as Magic, but didn't say which cards they're interlocked with, as they do in Yu-Gi-Oh, that would be virtually impossible for anyone without an insane level amount of time to memorize all the cards to play. And each game kind of does one or the other trade-off, which is interesting. Now, what's up with the customizing thing in and of itself, right? Like, as you were talking about, Bionic Me, I mean, if it's just which one the player vibes with, you said in the end, if it all boils down to the same, why not go with just what works best for you on an intuitive level, and or what you simply like for any reason, rational or not? This comment is slightly weird to me. I mean, right, well, of course, but the point of this parlay is to dissect why that would be the thing that you'd like over one or another. It doesn't all boil down to the exact same thing either, like the packaging matters. That's what we're talking about. Why do some people think this thing fits best for them? What constructs that? And you've paired that apart pretty well. That's why I was slightly confused that you made that comment. Like, you have done more than everyone else in this parlay to address that question. You might want a different level of speed in the activity, or you might want something that handles differently or has a different aesthetic that you enjoy. There's absolutely a phenomenon of people playing better when they have a character or a strategy that they think is better. Like when a graphic effect is flashier. There have been studies showing that in action games, people often perform better. Their physical skill goes up when the color effect on the screen of their attack is more fantastic. Seems like, what? But maybe they hit a flow state better, or they feel more confident, or it resonates with them more. I actually think that it's hard to appreciate how important that is, so I'm glad you brought it up. Right, like, it matters that you sort of resonate with this strategy to an extent. But this then means that, okay, so I guess being able to customize the strategy you play is valuable. We've done it. We somehow arrived in the middle of this insane topic at the answer is build systems. Incredible. And would you look at that? There's one more response. Ragnavar, in my experience of competitive activities, primarily video games, so little of it is about the outsmarting of your opponent at most levels of skill, and is instead about getting better at whatever the mechanics of the activity are that determine what you enjoy and thus what you do and don't stick with, that if we're talking about video games, if your skill level is equal enough to the opponent that outplaying the opponent is the means by which you win, so much of the experience otherwise is determined by your skills and not just reflexes, but it's an important skill, that makes the aspect about playing your opponent basically a non-factor in determining if you'll play something. Okay, so this is an important point. Yeah, most existing activities like this don't emphasize outplaying your opponent. That's true. Now, I don't think that this is in some ways a straw man argument, because that just happens to be true of most existing forms of these activities. That's not a problem with the idea of optimizing a game for outplaying your opponent, and there are games that focus more on that. But I think you make an important point here where, for a fighting game, for example, yeah, there is this element of outplaying your opponent, but when the skill levels are matched closely enough and people are playing at a high level enough that outplaying your opponent matters, so much more of what it took for you to get there was your mechanical skill that it arguably just doesn't matter that much. I mean, it will determine who wins here, but that seems like a really suboptimal way to focus on outplaying your opponent. The game is still mostly about your mechanical skill. Looking at it another way, this then means that being able to customize the way you play matters a ton. Because if you're going to get to the outplaying part of a game like that, you really want it to be that you're piloting something you enjoy. I mean, that fits with your proclivities as a player and your form of mechanical skill if that's involved in the game, but also just that you resonate with, like that you like, you know. You don't want to have to play for however long it takes to get good enough for the outplaying to matter with something that is other than exactly what you would enjoy. And therefore, being able to customize your playstyle, making a build, is surprisingly relevant to this activity, even though at first it seems like a total disaster, right? You can modify the options you have access to, and your opponent can't know what that is. Isn't that bad for outplaying them? But as we've unpacked over the course of this parlay, maybe not, actually. I mean, having that sort of gradual reveal of information is kind of cool. Like, that's interesting. And you can simply limit the possibility space of what the opponent can do. Anyway, we'll keep coming back to that. So that makes the aspect of outplaying your opponent for you, Ragnavar, often a non-factor in determining if you'll play something, because in many existing games that focus on that, other elements matter so much more in total. Right, that makes sense. That's not to say I ignore this aspect of competitive games. I've tried a few times to get into fighting games, but with a lack of new players in my circle, I'm left to either get bodied online or bodied by the couple of friends I've got that do play fighting games. And while I've enjoyed some of those times, I've not been able to actually stick with any. My skills are just not there, so I can't even begin to outplay the friends I have, and online matches are, well, online matches. On the flip side, I've spent a lot of time playing various first and third person shooters, and I'll even say that I'm slightly above the average in a couple. Even in these cases, though, much more of my enjoyment is from the systems, mechanics, and skill expression of the game, and not about outplaying my opponents. There's been a lot of Titanfall 2 matches where I've had a heap of fun, but lost real badly, and not even done amazingly due to one reason or another. But that doesn't always mar the experience, and I've had a lot of fun just playing as a sniper from several miles at the back of a battlefield map, and just spending ages sniping players from long distance without a care in the world for the objectives beyond aiming at enemy-controlled ones for more targets. So much of those experiences are defined for me in those sorts of experiences with the game, and not really my opponent all that much. Halo Reach custom games are another highlight of this for me. So much of them is about creating a cool new experience with the Forge and custom game tools that allows you to have fun with a bunch of friends, and so very little of it is about game theory when it comes down to enjoying them, even if one could apply that to it if they wished. Boiling them down to the point where game theory is all that remains feels like you've ended up boiling away the actual game you've assumedly come to play, for me at least, in most cases. Now, of course, that's just because these games aren't really trying to be focused on outplaying people. But I do think this is a really interesting point in that it covers a sort of side topic in this discussion. Yeah, in these games, it's arguably kind of bad that there is outplaying people, right? In some way, a lot of the enjoyment of the game is built around you not needing to worry about this stuff. But then in many cases, it's clear that that is what determines who ultimately wins a lot of matches. Let's go back to fighting games. You could look at them this different way. I mean, almost all of the activity is your skill and the knowledge you learn by playing. And so if you enjoy those things, why is it good for then an evenly matched matchup to be determined by outplaying your opponent instead? And you could argue that it just isn't, by the way. But I think in some cases it clearly is. You can see high-level matches where that pretty clearly is why one player wins over the other. That's bad, actually, I think. And you could argue that part of the reason is that these are also games not about kind of customizing your experience. You have known information, you practice, and you get to hone it, and having that be able to be taken away by some nerd with their game theory maybe isn't a good way for those games to... Maybe doing things to make it so these games are less about outplaying your opponent would be good. But that's only because those games are already very bad at optimizing for outplaying your opponent in my evaluation. You have more of your response, so I'm not saying you're saying something stupid and irrelevant. This is a preface to the other thing you're going to say. The audience doesn't know that. So I just wanted to make the point that I think this is an interesting sidebar. Like, yeah, it's sort of not good that this is a factor in many other games. Let's go back to the initial example of like rock, paper, scissors, or poker. Okay, so the rules are super basic, which makes it a good vehicle for outplaying your opponents because there is little else. right? You don't have to spend most of the experience being mechanically skilled at rock, paper, scissors to enjoy outplaying your opponent in rock, paper, scissors, if you will enjoy that. Rock, paper, scissors is a useful example because we can see that maybe that one went a little too far and there aren't that many hooks to figure out what your opponent would be thinking to hang the game on, and adding a few more could maybe improve the experience. But having removed a bunch of build-up to that point is good for optimizing for the outplaying experience. And on another level, I want to outplay my opponent more if they made their character. If they just have a standard character, I want to fight that character to an extent. And it is interesting how it's sort of customized to the way they play. People talk about like this player's Fox or this player's Falco, in a fighting game, sure. But at the same time, I would argue that is still a side element to the game. You are mostly playing against the character. I'm sure people would debate that, but I think that's a fair evaluation. So there's a divide here. I feel like physical skill and knowledge checks are sort of over here and would be a more honing focused activity. Whereas if you're going to focus on outplaying people, you don't want the game to have no hooks for you to interpret things on, but you kind of don't want them to be these things. And so what's left is for them to be innovator things, like you come up with a new idea for your build or something. Buildcraft, surprisingly. I didn't put this in here. You're the person who wrote Buildcraft in this parlay. However, Ragnarvar continues, in some games, I found myself starting to feel like game theory is what I'm supposed to care about, divorced from any other qualities of a game. Well, yeah, it doesn't matter what you're supposed to care about, just that the game is maybe optimized for these experiences. They do exist. I think that's where my own friction with fighting games comes from. So much of how you win is about knowing what your opponent can do and what you can do to counter them. I wouldn't say it's rock, paper, scissors. Again, that feels too reductive, right? But I can agree that once you're seeing the game theory, must outplay opponent design and approach to a game, it does warp the experience in a way that can fundamentally improve or ruin an experience, depending on how that affects the rest of the game. Since being a very young kid, I've loved Age of Empires 2, but I really, really hated playing it against someone I knew who was much better at it and had spent time learning what to do if one wanted to play an online match, while I and others who played with me didn't have that knowledge. Honestly, I didn't even want it after experiencing it. I had much more fun as a kid playing against a bunch of the super easy AI making a massive galleon fleet on an island's map and just blowing them all up for fun than I did playing against a human player that knew what they were doing more than I did, or afterwards what that person teamed up with us to fight the super hard AI. I just really enjoyed the create a civilization that can support a cool military aspect much more than the micro and action per minute needed to beat anything actually hard. Right, and so here we're tackling the subject of you can sort of have this meta knowledge and it will reveal whether the game is more focused on that or not, or whether you enjoy the game more focused on that or not. And some games may be in a bit of a superposition here. I think it's useful to have these more extreme examples because some games are not like this. It's not up for interpretation whether rock, paper, scissors is about this or not. There literally are zero other gameplay components except for this. I would argue there is no physical skill involved. It is just the outplaying thing. There's no other actions you can take. It's only that. Likewise, there are other games that are clearly only about the skill component. A running race against people are sprinting against and racing against each other on a track. I would be interested to hear if people feel like there are outplaying things there actually. But anyway, I would say straightforwardly, I hope you can see this type of example in general. There isn't any outplaying. It's just your skill thing. And so sure, there are lots of examples in this parlay where it's sort of debatable. But I would argue that for a lot of them, you can see that if you were to think of the game as being this or that, it changes a lot and in some cases becomes clearly very silly. For example, if you play Yu-Gi-Oh! And you think of it as a skill expression game and not an outplaying your opponent game, you just learn to do your combo in the correct order. You see what I mean? Like that sort of doesn't... What? And so the fact that you need to learn to do that to play the skill, the outplaying part is sort of a flaw in a way. Likewise, I think you're absolutely right that like a real-time strategy game or like a civilization management game, these games change a lot if you think of them like this or like that. Sure, good example. Funnily enough, Absolver, we're back, has been different, as the core mechanics of the game, especially the build craft your fighting move deck aspect, is so satisfying as a game concept, and as the AI opponents you see littered around the world are so aggressive even at their weakest, Absolver naturally makes me want to get better at it, and to learn what I need to do well in it, even against actual human opponents. There's a really interesting tactility, all words are made up, to the experience, that might be correct, to how much your build craft will affect how well you do, that it makes me want to explore the game more, as the core of what makes a good move for your deck is actually fairly simple to work with once you've gained some experience and taken a look at some of the online content. It feels very open-ended to doing your own thing, so long as you account for some jank in the code and some limitations you might put in yourself if you're not careful with your move flow planning. You can easily end up getting shut down by players, even by accident, if you've gone too far into slow moves with bad neutral frame data, and this game is very neutral heavy, or you use too many moves that behave similarly, opening yourself up to easier counters, parries, dodges, blocks. So here you can see again the being able to pick a specific way you play that fits you, but then the outputs of that way you play are kind of known quantities to your opponent, so they don't need to know exactly what you can do to be able to play around you a little bit. This is the thing I was praising about Magic the Gathering. You can customize what your specific strategy does to a sufficiently granular level. Well, it's up for debate, but Bionic Bee, you don't have to consider it to be a sufficiently granular level, but I think it is arguably, for a lot of people, sufficiently granular, while providing outputs where you don't need to know exactly what their specific cards will all do, or every card in their deck or whatever, to respond to them in some way. And so while it does have the sort of worst of both worlds, where you have a bunch of your own abilities and they don't come packaged together, but you kind of have to know what all of them would potentially do, knowing what all of them could potentially do is actually not that bad. Like, a lot of it is removal and counterspells and drawing cards, etc. Or, different frame data and different types of attacks, I would imagine, in Absolver, right? Absolver is the kind of game all about outsmarting and outplaying your opponent, but because it's designed around a system that is open to player choice and skill expression, and those aspects are baked into the game theory parts of Absolver's design, it doesn't feel like I'm doing badly because I can't do the specific mental task and reflexive use of a specific move that counters my opponent's move. And instead, I need to play around what I chose to bring to the fight and what the game plan my move deck is built around. Sorry, move deck could trip me up, but I get what you mean, which means to deal with opponents needing to be baked into it beforehand. I do think that's probably what it all boils down to, at least for me. How integrated into the game is this emphasis on outplaying an opponent, and how much is it down to specifics as opposed to more general problem solving, player choice, and flexible systems used creatively? I'd love to enjoy games like Age of Empires 2 online, or online fighting games that aren't Absolver, but I just really struggle with how much more locked down they are as an experience, and how much I don't like the mechanics when put into that context. I quickly gave up on Overwatch after the open beta and the initial release, as it felt very much pick a hero that does what the team needs and do exactly what that hero wants to do well. Whereas I really got obsessed with Battleborn, and more specifically playing the ultra swingy Orendi, never heard of it, as you had so many more ways to tailor the core experience the way you wanted. And I think that's that aspect plus enjoying the core gameplay systems that determine if a competitive game is going to work for me. I can only imagine that it's finding the balance and implementation of the game theory design into the core of the game that you enjoy, alongside actually liking the underlying core gameplay systems, that determines it for others. Yes, what a way to bring it on home. So I think we have a conclusion here. Now, it's me. I believe that people are not as skeptical of perspectives as it is worth being. So I don't think this is just what will make you enjoy a competitive experience like this. I think this is pretty clearly just a better way to do. There's not really any drawbacks to doing it this way. If you have a competitive experience that is designed to create counterplay specifically, minimizing the amount of skill and knowledge check stuff that you need to do to get to the counterplay, plus allowing the player to customize the abilities they have to interact with their opponent, plus making sure that the outputs of those abilities are still relatively limited such that the opponent doesn't need to know specifically what the opponent has to interact with them, and then combining that with a gameplay speed that players are comfortable with. seems to me like it is essentially just better at everything than doing any of those things different if you want this specific type of experience in a competition. There could be other good types of competitions, but I think if you want the counterplay thing, this gives you more of it for everybody. There will not be people who like this exact thing, and we're not just confusing terms. They really do like this exact thing, but they just magically don't want those factors to be in there. Unless it's something like they don't want to come up with the set of moves they have to use, but they still want to be able to know what their opponent has, and so the outputs being regular is still good. But in that case, you can just net deck. Like you do that's never really an issue in these games. You're allowed to just not design your own play style, so that's not really a flaw. I don't think that that's a big deal, as long as it's meaningful to design your own play style. The option to just not is always there if you wanted to. In Yu-Gi-Oh, while it does create a lot of overhead to learn all these cards, the nice thing is that because cards are all connected in these archetypes, you can pick up and make a good Yu-Gi-Oh deck much faster than you can make one in Magic, at least in my experience. And the reason is that the cards are interconnected. You can just look up like, oh, I want to play the Sky Striker stuff. Because I just want to know what is out there as support for this archetype, if I just look up a bunch of people's Sky Striker decks, you learn a lot of that information very fast. Whereas the possibilities for making a Magic deck are less obvious. Like it isn't as easy to find out what would be the support for this specific card. Like there might be some very unusual, not named on the card's advantages to playing with that card. Now, your opponent won't get blown out by them, really, because they don't need to know exactly what the card does. It provides reliable, limited scope outputs. But you as a player, yes, for you to craft the system to be a tool you want to play the game with that you personally enjoy, yes, I think that is much more time-consuming and kind of the Achilles heel of Magic the Gathering. That can be very fun as a process of discovery, but it can take a lot of time, for sure. And I feel like these basically nail it. We did way better than I expected with this subject. That was very satisfying. Thank you. Yeah, I basically feel like we've gotten it down to, okay, this is what you'd want to do. Could we potentially make a game where the speed that players have to work with is varied? Maybe. So, if you look at these criteria, well, you have it be that the player's inputs, the player's tools to interact with the game can be changed. They can build them themselves. But the outputs of those tools are relatively known, so the opponent can interact with them without knowing exactly what the player has chosen to use. And the game doesn't require too much like mechanical skill or knowledge checky stuff. Again, we kind of already handled that. You don't need to know exactly what the opponent does. But then the one variable in there that just isn't objectifiable is how fast, how much time pressure you want on this subject. At least that's the only one we found so far. So could we create a game where you can modify that? I had this idea for a game concept a little while ago that you're welcome to steal if you make games. I'm sure you'll do it different than I would. Just don't be surprised if one day I do make this as well. Which is, it's like competitive Guitar Hero, or reverse competitive Guitar Hero. Okay. Your spells or abilities are like, I'm using the Guitar Hero metaphor. It's not actually Guitar Hero, like notes that you fire upon like 5 lanes, beams, rails toward your opponent. And they can fire back their own, notes or blocks, pixels, I guess, along those rails. So maybe I'll do a fireball spell and I'll make a big red sphere of notes, of, very pixelated sphere, because it's only on 5 different rails that will float toward the opponent. Maybe they'll block it by creating a wall of earth, and this will be like a thick row of pixels on each line, and maybe earth doesn't catch on fire, and so that also absorbs more pixels worth of fire that I threw at them. It doesn't matter specifically, I'm just getting it in your head that this is a thing you could do, even at just Guitar Hero, competitive Guitar Hero somehow, or Tetris 100. You could change the speed, right? Like you could just change the speed to whatever you want. The game will have a speed where it feels better to a lot of people, but it basically works if you just alter the speed. This definitely isn't true of every type of game. There will be games where the timbre or the flavor of the game changes pretty drastically if you change the speed too much and doesn't like exactly work Just as an example, if you made Elden Ring's combat of a very different speed, some animations will look way weirder to visually understand when the hurt box of the animation comes out than they do when they are played at like a certain other speed that they're optimized for. The attack will become hard to dodge in a new way that didn't exist before if you change the speed too much. Or if you play like chess or a card game and the time for each turn is like really, really quick, there becomes a new element where many decks or strategies will struggle to even execute the thing they're doing fast enough. Whereas that really, at least for me so far playing Yu-Gi-Oh, that just isn't a factor. Like you can easily execute even very long combos with plenty of time left over, provided you know what the combo is. Like you wrote it down or you know offhand, but you've done it with not that much practice. I haven't had that much practice. That's just not an issue. I'm sure that comes up from time to time, but you get the point I'm trying to make. If you increased the restriction on time enough in a game like Yu-Gi-Oh, there would start to be decks that are very good if you can do the thing they do, but you literally just can't because it takes too long to execute, and that isn't an element of the game that exists without adjusting the time like that. But you could make a game that doesn't exactly change, or elements of the game do not like appear and disappear when the game is played fast and slow to an extent, and then you could just adjust it to be the speed that a lot of people enjoy. I recently tried a game called Maiden and Spell, which comes to mind as well. This is a game where it's like a 1v1 dueling a bullet hell game, basically. Interesting concept. I'm not enjoying it that much so far, but I got it because I thought it would be an interesting design to explore, and it has been. And you could imagine that. It could be at a different speed. You could just make the projectiles move at different speeds. That probably won't have no effect on the balance. If there's a way to block incoming projectiles, for example, it might become way less practical to use such an ability, but you could figure it out. You see what I mean? You can make a competitive game that fits these criteria and is thus optimized for counterplay, where you can just adjust the speed of the game. That is definitely in theory possible. Now, I think the bad news here is that once we've made the criteria that make for a good wizard poker experience specific enough, as we have here, it's now clear that it is possible that this game does not exist. Like that there are 0 games that do these things. But you could make one. And if you can make one that lets you adjust the speed, you can make one to rule them all. I want there to be variety in the world when there is a need for variety in the world. But if there can just be a really good wizard poker experience that can be like adjusted to fit most players, come on, we got to make that, right? Like that, we got, let's have some of that. And just as I say this, it's possible that somebody has a game that they think may be all of these things. You might even argue that there is a game we've already mentioned that is all of these things. Maybe Absolver, though I'm worried about something like a fighting game or like the Elden Ring example I gave with like dodging attacks and telegraphs if you slow down the speed or speed up the speed too much. And like Magic the Gathering, I have a higher opinion of than when I started this parlay. As someone who's played for a very long time, I have my criticisms about Magic, but I have to say I feel like it fits these criteria very well. Though the time adjustment thing is like somewhat of an issue. You can definitely build decks where there is no execution time issue. It's much less of a thing than in Yu-Gi-Oh! That you need to do a sequence of abilities on your turn that takes like a while to execute. With a deck that is actually any good. If you've played a lot of public Commander, a lot of people are playing these solitaire fiddlefests, but they're not like good. And I would argue they're not arguably that much fun. They're mostly just adapted to the really broken Commander meta at the moment. And you can, and in tournament and the way we play Commander, people do play the game in a way where you don't have to worry about that. But there's still some minor concern that you can't just adjust the time you have to play a turn in Magic infinitely. Like, that's not perfect, but it's certainly not bad. There's some decent solutions, I think, out there. Competitive D&D PvP. Could we do something there maybe? Or like you have limited time to make your character? But no, that's too much of a knowledge check. I mean, and again, the thing with Magic is that there is a big knowledge check problem, but it's kind of a unique problem, a little bit like the Yu-Gi-Oh one, where actually finding the way to construct the playstyle that will uniquely fit your needs but have general outputs so your opponent can still interact with it. Like, that part does take a lot of time, just one-off time that then doesn't interfere with gameplay. Like, that's good, but it's still not good that you need to do that thing. But that feels solvable. Again, in Yu-Gi-Oh!, in the Master Duel client, they have this cool thing where you can click a card and it'll say, like, it's a Tearlaments card. And you'll go, okay, I don't know what that is. I don't even know, as a new player, if Tearlaments is an archetype. There's a bunch of cards called Tearlaments that work with each other, or whether this card is just called that. That's just the fantasy name this card has, right? In Master Duel, you can hit a button that tells you about related cards, and the game will just tell you if it's related to those other cards. Incredible. Good. Now, the problem kind of comes back again, where it's like, okay, so you can find the other cards in that archetype, but they kind of just did have the same name anyway, and the problem reverses a little. You need to read basically all of those cards to know what that one card does. So in Magic, you don't need to do that, but you need to actually find the cards that would work well with something. In Tearlaments, you don't need to find the cards, but you do then need to, like, read all of them and figure out the extremely complicated web of interactions they would have to create a meaningful strategy, which takes a while. It's very common in Yu-Gi-Oh! That people build decks or play decks that can do something and the player just doesn't know that it can do that, which is kind of insane in Magic. Like, that only happens to a very limited degree. That's weird. And there's not really a good way to tutorialize that, in my opinion. Without doing a ton of outside research. In the best case, in Magic, you can sometimes syntactically search for the action you want if you can conceive of it. So if a card really wants you to play spells from exile, you can just type in your deck's colors, like the word exile in the card's text, and then just look up those cards and start narrowing it down by degree. And Magic being slightly less broad is good here. There's still a big enough possibility space that the thing you're looking for usually exists, but there often isn't like a ridiculous amount of it. I mean, exile is quite common in and of itself, but something more specific than that. I have this deck that is built around forcing the opponent to play their spells again from exile, usually at a tax. So it's a tempo deck. It buys time against the opponent. It slows the opponent down to get under them and kind of build up its own advantage. But it builds that tempo by temporarily removing the opponent's cards, but still allowing them to cast them. They just have to cast them from exile. There is a solid handful of cards that do that. This is a tiny leaders deck, so there don't have to be that many. There's maybe like 6 or 7 cards right now, and actually I don't play with the outside universe cards in Magic, but the new Avatar set actually just added a bunch of those. Look up the airbending mechanic if you're interested in that. I'm not going to use those, but that's cool. They would be very good in this deck. They're in the right colors too. And my commander for that deck has an ability that benefits me whenever either player plays something from exile. I'm planning to primarily use this against my opponent. My deck isn't too focused on doing that itself. And it's been pretty fun. It creates this fun dynamic, well, harsh, honestly. It's powerful for what it is in our play group. It might be a little too strong. I've already nerfed it a few times. Fun dynamic where the opponent never has any of their stuff destroyed. You can still have your spell. You just need to cast it over and over again. And I get a ton of resources when you do that. And so, and you can make that decision. But it's all right there. You just kind of learn that gimmick about the deck and then you're good. You could have never played against the deck ever before. And if you just read my commander, that's it. You get the idea. You don't need to know what any other specific card does. They'll all kind of fit the theme of that. They either enable that strategy or I've made the deck focused in such a way. And I would argue that Magic rewards this or rewards generalist strategies that don't play cards that are overly synergistic, whereas Yu-Gi-Oh! Then goes further in the synergy direction to the point that you kind of need to know what a bunch of the cards do for any one card's meaning to actually be apparent to you. And then the final thing, of course, is that Magic has land as a mechanic. Building up your mana over time means that the opponent knows, okay, but you can only play 2 mana worth of spells. If Magic didn't have so much power creep in the modern era, and you can just not play with those cards, and people do not play with those cards, you kind of know what they can do for 2 mana. I mean, they can't play a 5/5 for all you know, unless their deck has a specific mechanism that has become clear that lets them do that. And so yeah, like that helps a lot as well. And so I think the idea that the game builds up over time is also really interesting. At the very beginning of the parlay, we talked about the health bar in a fighting game and also things like life totals in Magic. Now, I was referencing Yu-Gi-Oh! And being coy at the beginning when I said it has to be that the resource matters, but like not too much. The thing in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is that if you're playing against most decks, you cannot leave yourself open and take a hit. First of all, you don't even choose to do that. Your opponent chooses what to attack. And can only attack your stuff and not attack you directly unless they kill your creatures. But like you would never want to not play monsters so your opponent can just hit you in Yu-Gi-Oh! Because 90% of decks can kill you in one turn from almost any amount of life in Yu-Gi-Oh! And so that's not an element of the game. Again, this on its own isn't a death sentence, but I do think that is not good for this type of counterplay. And I think Magic does that pretty well. You know, fighting games, you do that pretty well. It can be universalized. Having any system where you kind of build up over time or get like close to losing, I set it as a score at the beginning of the game, matters a lot. In Yu-Gi-Oh, that very rarely matters at all. You could play Yu-Gi-Oh surprisingly well if you at all times simply covered up most of the numbers on the cards for their attack and your life total. That it just doesn't matter 9 times out of 10. And that's fine. Like, it's fine for what the game is going for. But I do think that that is a point against this type of counterplay. It is good if that matters, I think. And mana is another way to do that, basically. Rather than having it only be that when your health is low or your life points are low, then that tension matters. Building up your mana store in Magic could be seen as one example of a way to make that build up at the beginning of the game as well. And then, you know, generally it matters less as the game goes on. You have less cards, or your engine for drawing cards is set up, so it doesn't really matter how many cards you have. And you have enough mana, you have the amount of mana the deck is going to have, you know, or you can, again, produce so much that it becomes clear that you have a ton. And what you can specifically do doesn't matter quite as much. But yeah, I think that has a lot of potential as well. So some way to kind of build up and then wind down, or like constrict a match down to its conclusion. Sounds really cool. There's a piece of design in Draw Steel, which is Matt Colville and MCDM's RPG that's coming out, where all of their characters were designed. Basically, they hate the resource management in D&D, they've said. And so their characters are designed to all kind of wind up during combat. And in theory, this was a thing that happened when I played World of Warcraft PvP, which I played a ton of. I might have played more World of Warcraft PvP than any other... I might have done more World of Warcraft PvP than literally any other human activity in my life. It's just that I was very young when I did it. So I'm not really sure. Anyway, and there's this mechanic. So in WoW, there's the warrior class. Most characters have mana in World of Warcraft, but some characters have their own resource, and warriors have rage. It's kind of what it sounds like. As you start the fight, you have none, and then as you do damage and take damage and some other things, you generate rage. You can dump this into some powerful abilities. Now, I think that in practice, rage got out of control in World of Warcraft, and even in all of my time playing PvP, I never felt it was that meaningful to like watch a player's rage gauge, to like wait for when they could do their big thing, because you could build rage so fast with the effective ways to do it, but you don't have to make it that way. Like, just nerf that back. MCDM's RPG, they've tried to make basically every class like this. You kind of build up your resources throughout combat. A really clever thing about that is that it means that as the combat goes on, the odds of the combat petering out and having this really slow conclusion where there's like one goblin left and everyone's out of spell slots, so nobody can kill the goblin and you're just plinking away at a dude's health, is obliterated, because by the end of the fight, you have so many resources. It's not going to end like that. There have been lots of attempts to address this like turn-based combat petering out problem. Another example is in Persona 5. Once you've done damage of a type the enemy is vulnerable to and stunned them, to every enemy, you can do an all-out attack, and usually you will just kill them all. The idea is that when you have tactically won the fight, we hand-wave the actual ending of the fight. The fight is about the tactics. It's about the outplaying the opponent and having the response to them. It's not about the pedantic, like, oh, well, technically you still have a little health left. Now, that can be fine, of course. I'm just saying you could see how you could apply this to these types of games. to make it feel like the amount of health that it is scary to leave yourself at gets larger and larger as the game goes on, because the opponent now has a 12/12 in their graveyard and they can just resurrect it and attack you for 12 damage. It would have been fine to stay at like 5 health on turn 3 if for some reason you were that low, but now that they have this, it's way scarier, and so tension rises like that. And that is something that naturally brings games to a conclusion in Magic in a way. I actually think that's really interesting as a difference in Yu-Gi-Oh, but it's a topic for another time. The way that a Yu-Gi-Oh match, like, there's the big initial volley and then it can kind of like peter out and become a slugfest. I actually think that's really interesting, but anyway, it's something else. In Magic, that I feel that does not usually happen, except when the decks are not of a very high power level. And Commander eliminates that pretty well. The point is that you could make a system like that for a game to focus on its tension. And you could even argue that if you like this idea, you might like Persona 5 and Metaphor Refantatio relatively more, because they're not trying to make it be about, again, kind of like whittling down the enemy's health. I mean, by the way, in D&D, and the reason I'm not that interested in this in Draw Steel is that that's already a game master flaw. Like, why are the creatures fighting to the death if basically all of them are killed already? The goblin doesn't register any fear and just like run away at the end. Is it because the players are loot goblins, huh? And don't want the goblin to run away because then they lose loot? Why don't you just give them a treasure chest that is the thing the goblins are guarding that has a loot? There's really no reason to have that problem in the first place in most TTRPGs already, but I understand most people are kind of obsessed with just playing the exact thing in the book as they see it and nothing else, and so making a system that avoids this problem entirely is of some value, but I just feel like that's sort of unnecessary. Anyway, making the game about that experience is good, I guess. I just feel like, I don't know, my D&D games are about people often not fighting to the death. That is a part of the experience. My players know that going in. You can just say that the game is about that. It's a tabletop role-playing game. Anyway, whatever. No shade toward that game. I think it's an interesting mechanic idea, but I think it's much more interesting for a video game or a hard-coded rules game, because it forces the game to kind of climax. Take me out to dinner first, instead of sort of petering out into its conclusion. And that creates some opportunities for counterplay. You know that there's this tension building in the fight, and that determines how you will try to outplay your opponent. So lots of things you could do. So I think I'm also going to add to my notes a score of some kind. Seems also valuable, critical for this subject. Okay, that was a lot, but I think we've basically covered it. So just to summarize one more time, it seems to me that if you want an experience that is focused on outplaying your opponent like this, first of all, very few experiences optimized for that experience exist, as far as we can tell. There are lots of games, most games, arguably, most competitions include this element, but very few of them are actually about it, though it is debatable in some cases. Again, in many cases, it will be like the fighting game thing where, well, so much of that experience overall isn't about the counterplay. But at the end of the day, a lot of games do boil down to just like who counterplayed who. And so does that feel like it's more about counterplay or not? That you might consider that subjective. But at the very least, the total volume of time you play the game will never mostly be about outplaying your opponent, I would argue. But you can have a game like that. There are some existing games that are arguably focused on this, or at least can be arguably focused on this. I feel like Magic and Yu-Gi-Oh! Both don't necessarily do this consistently, but you certainly can play in a way where they're consistently focused on that. Absolver, I'll have to try, I think. So that's that. And I thought the Pokemon example that's a pretty key one. I'm happy that came up, though I did bring it up in the first version of this prompt. And so having it be that the experience is focused on that, that's possible, but you will find many cases where this game theory thing comes up of like going the level above your opponent's assumptions. Usually the game isn't built around it, but you could have a game that is built around it. How would you do that? Well, one thing that's good is to have it be that the possibility space of things the player can do is limited somehow. It might be that they can pick every card in their 100 card deck, but they have a limited amount of mana and limited colors. It could be that they play an archetype, like in Yu-Gi-Oh, and thus they're going to float around playing certain cards from that archetype that you may, yes, need to know ahead of time, but you could know ahead of time. They could play a fighting game character, and it's the fighting game character's kit. You could have a Pokemon matchup where they only have limited moves and they have an item, and you can conclude what those are over the course of the match. So that they have some choice in what abilities they bring to the table, but they are from a meaningfully limited possibility space, or the way they can use them is meaningfully like gated somehow. Yet, second thing, those outputs have a meaningful limited space of outputs. So when they do their combo in their deck, or they play their value engine and commander, or whatever, the space of what that does, the results of that, you know, removal or damage to your face or big creatures or whatever, is limited enough that you don't need to know the specific thing they're using to have things that generally respond to it. For example, you don't need to know if your opponent will have creatures to want to include removal in your commander deck, because everybody has creatures because they're commander. You can actually make a commander deck without a creature in it, but I mean, you can assume that it's good to have removal. That's my point. To an extent. In Commander, a really common one is not every deck is focused on artifacts and enchantments, but most people assume that those will be useful, and you will find that in Commander, the general assumption is that you can just include those. If they're good value, you will have targets. It's a multiplayer game. You have 3 other opponents. You will be able to use artifact or enchantment removal. There's enough of those as utility pieces around in decks that are not focused on them. Again, you don't have to know exactly what they're bringing to do things that will counter them, and you'll be able to apply as tools to counter them without knowing specifically what they're going to use. And you can make a judgment call about how to use them. And you can do that meaningfully, not perfectly, but meaningfully, without knowing every card in their deck. If you don't know what your opponent's combo is in Yu-Gi-Oh!, kill the final boss monster, you know, sure. You often can't do that because it'll be immune to effects, and that's another part of the problem with Yu-Gi-Oh! But anyway, you can do that to an extent, you know. Don't counter their starter, you know. Counter their extender, or like something in the middle often works fairly well. You won't be able to do the thing at the end, and the thing at the beginning often isn't important enough or is designed to be resilient. So counter something in the middle. You know, you can kind of do it. I do think this is a big weakness of Yu-Gi-Oh! But it's not impossible. It's not. I do that all the time. Well, I lose doing it all the time, but it's possible, you know. And then finally, that there is some flexibility to the speed of the game, or you pick a game that is suitable to the speed or pace that you want, such that you have time to think about this stuff without feeling overwhelmed, but while feeling stimulated. There's enough of a time pressure to actually activate your excitement centers or whatever, to tickle your wiggle with playing the game. And yeah, I'm not sure we have games that fit all those criteria that well. Creating the additional tension by having a score or some kind of measure of where the game is to create these different meta pressures where the player will behave differently because it's a different part of the match, and then you can respond to that and you have a chance to outplay them that way. Also very good. And a lot of games have dabbled in many of these things, but really focused on this, I don't know. If you feel like you have good examples of this, other than what we talked about during this parlay, please tell me. You know, go to the Discord. And if you'd like to join us for a crew parlay, we'd love to have you. I'll read you the prompt for next month, for November 2025. And you have the rest of the month, and then usually a few days at the beginning of the next month in December to respond. We'd love to have you. I offer this at a lower tier, at the $5 tier, because I want to be able to include a lot of people in a big video. It's fun. This was one of my favorite ones so far, so I hope you enjoyed it. Here's the prompt. Here's the next one if you want it. And remember, I give this to people who are Twitch subscribers too, if you have your Discord account connected. So a lot of you listening have this for free, so please use it if you want to. The prompt is, what are you looking for in a sequel to a game? This is originally from Just Rusty, actually. You proposed this one. Do you prefer a sequel which hones a formula, giving more of the same, but taking on lessons learned from previous titles, or which radically departs from the original to break new ground? With games, I, Zandy, think it's interestingly distinct from other media in that this determines what you will have to physically do, not just what the contents of your entertainment will be, if a game is similar to or a departure from its prequel. If there's a particular sequel to something you've been waiting for, that would be interesting to hear about too. So I hope you'll join us for that if you're interested. Again, there's a link in the description, and seriously, please, if you have examples of these games, we've come pretty far looking for them already. Please, give to me. Tell me about them. See you in the next one.